in certain circumstances. The lockdown in England is due to be lifted in full on June the 21st, but the Prime Minister warns that introducing a vaccine passport is fraught with difficulty.
We've never thought in terms of having something that you have to show to go to, a pub or a theatre. And so there are deep and complex issues that we need to explore, ethical issues.
We'll have details of the policy review that's now been launched. Also tonight, in Scotland, the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, sets out what she calls a progressive easing of COVID restrictions. Unemployment at its highest rate in 5 years, with young people bearing the brunt. Tiger Woods is in hospital with serious leg injuries after a car accident in Los Angeles. And the online version of London Fashion Week as the industry appeals for help with the effects of lockdown and Brexit.
And on Reporting Scotland, we'll bring you everything you need to know on those changes to the lockdown restrictions here. And Alex Salmond will now not appear before MSPs investigating the Scottish Government's harassment procedure tomorrow.
Good evening. The Prime Minister has confirmed that the UK government will consider the case for the introduction of so-called vaccine passports. The document could take the form of a vaccine certificate or proof of COVID status, and the NHS mobile app could be modified to carry that information. But Mr Johnson was keen to emphasise the considerable difficulties involved, and it is an idea that he and other ministers have dismissed several times in the past. He said he was still confident that all restrictions in England could be lifted by June the 21st. In Scotland, the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, has unveiled what she called a deliberately cautious strategy with a phased reopening of the economy. More on Scotland in just a moment, but first our Deputy Political Editor Vicky Young on the debate at Westminster.
Up and down the country, every minute of the day. People are getting some protection from the virus that's changed our lives.
3, 2, 1, shut scratch.
This is our way out of COVID restrictions. If everything goes according to plan, this summer dance floors, theatres and concert venues could be packed once more. But should everyone be let through the doors, or only those who've been vaccinated? Ministers need to decide soon.
We're looking at a novelty for our country. We haven't had stuff like this before. We've never thought in terms of having something that you have to show to go to, a pub or a theatre. And so there are deep and complex issues that we need to explore, ethical issues.
Not everyone is waiting for the government review. To protect vulnerable residents, some care homes are asking employees for proof they've had a vaccine.
With new staff that are joining us, we're just going to make it a requirement that they have to have the vaccine. And if they're not willing to, then they can't work for us.
It's not just the care sector taking this approach. Other companies want employees to be vaccinated too.
It's going to be the protection and safety of their staff and also protection and safety of their customers. So I feel it's a no-brainer, basically.
What about people who decide that they either can't have one for medical reasons or they don't want to have one? It's not compulsory in this country. Is that unfair on them?
The ones that don't want to have it, that's not unfair. That's their decision, that's their choice. But I think it's going to mean that they won't get a job. They won't be able to go to pubs, restaurants, theatres, or even travel. So that's their choice.
Ministers accept that other countries are likely to ask for vaccine passports before we can travel abroad, but some say using them at home is unfair.
It's really important that the government holds fast to the idea that vaccination is voluntary. It's a fundamental right that we should be able to choose what medical treatment we have or we don't have. Inevitably, those people who would be most disadvantaged by any system would be those people who are already marginalised, already poorer, or already disadvantaged in other ways.
For weeks, the government's ruled out a vaccine passport or certificate for domestic use, but that's now changed. There's going to be a review and ministers say they're going into it with an open mind. One idea being looked at is to use the existing NHS app so people can record whether they've been vaccinated or had a negative test before they enter a venue. The government knows that vaccinations and testing are the key to opening up many businesses, but they need to avoid a divisive two-tier system. Vicky Young, BBC News, Westminster.
And our home editor, Mark Easton, is with me, listening carefully to the Prime Minister there. Mark, he didn't sound at all certain as to whether he wanted it or not.
I think you could hear the equivocation in his voice when talking about a vaccination passport. Conservative ministers are generally pretty queasy about the idea of identification papers. You'll remember 20 years ago the row over ID cards, which were portrayed as un-British. But there is, I think, a certain inevitability about some kind of vaccine passport, and that's why the government is looking at whether the NHS app, the one we use to check our medical records and test results, whether that could be adapted securely to show both vaccination status and, as Vicky was saying, COVID status. And the thought is that if you can show either that you've had a jab or that you've recently tested negative, that actually gets around the discrimination problem of people who cannot or prefer not to have the vaccine. But there's a lot more work to be done. There are technical questions about how you make sure that confidential medical data is safe and secure, and practical questions about how you make sure that the passport is available to all and acceptable by all, not just nationally but internationally. We know that major airlines are already saying they're going to demand a vaccine certificate to fly to certain places, and countries like Greece are encouraging the EU to introduce a vaccine certificate for tourists to go on holiday this summer. So some politicians may not like the idea of having state papers required to go to the pub or the football or the theatre, but this may just be another example of how the pandemic is forcing society really to adapt to new and often uncomfortable ways.
Mark, many thanks again. Mark Easton there, our home editor. Now, let's take a look at the latest official figures then on the pandemic. They show there were 8,489 new infections recorded in the latest 24-hour period. It means an average of 10,882 new cases were recorded per day in the last week. The latest figure for the number of people across the UK in hospital with coronavirus is 16,797, and that includes suspected cases in Wales. In the past 24 hours, 548 deaths have been recorded. That's people who died within 28 days of a positive COVID test. On average, 444 deaths were announced every day in the past week, and the total number of people who've died so far in this pandemic is 121,305. Let's have a look at vaccinations. More than 192,000 people had their first dose of a vaccine in the latest 24-hour period, and that means that close to 18 million people across the UK have now had their first vaccination. Well, the First Minister of Scotland has set out what she called a progressive easing of COVID restrictions, with the reopening of non-essential businesses, including shops, restaurants and hairdressers, starting in the last week of April. From the 15th of March, 4 people from 2 households will be allowed to meet outdoors, and all primary and more secondary pupils could return to school, with some outdoor sports for young people being allowed. And then from April the 5th, it's hoped that the stay-at-home rule could be lifted, with places of worship beginning to open up and schools ready to accept all children at that point. And from the 26th of April, other parts of the economy would start to reopen, and Scotland will return to its previous levels system. Nicola Sturgeon says that restrictions could be lifted more quickly if cases remain low and the vaccine rollout continues to go well. Our Scotland correspondent Alexandra Mackenzie has more details.
Cautiously and gradually, that's how Scotland will emerge from lockdown. Between now and the end of April, there will be a slow easing of some restrictions. The First Minister told the Scottish Parliament the current situation is promising but precarious.
Taking the brakes off too quickly will allow the virus to get ahead of us again and put our progress out of lockdown into reverse. I appreciate that this can be, indeed is, a frustrating message, but it is an essential one.
The reopening of Scotland's economy, which includes shops, bars, restaurants, gyms and hairdressers, is expected to start in the last week of April, when the country will move from lockdown back into the level system. Karen Forrett owns several clothes shops. She has already permanently closed 2 of her businesses during the pandemic.
If we are allowed to open, we need people to be able to come. We need them to be allowed to travel in public transport. We need them to be allowed to travel, more than a few miles, so that they can actually use the non-essential retailers to be allowed to open back up. Otherwise, it's pointless.
The government said schools are a priority. Early years and a limited number of senior students returned to the classroom yesterday. All primary and more secondary pupils could return from the 15th of March. The rest could go back from the 5th of April. Today's announcement will be good news for many, but others say it falls short of expectations and lacks clarity about the way forward. In Glencoe, the snow is in abundance, but the slopes are empty. In what should be the height of the ski season, the resorts remain closed.
A lot of our skiers live from one season to the next for their fix of skiing and snowboarding, and I think for a lot of people the benefits of being out and getting out there in what is, we believe a safe environment would be hugely beneficial for the population, especially the local population.
The leader of the Scottish Conservatives at Holyrood said people had a right to be disappointed.
This isn't a route map out of COVID, it is a holding document for the next 8 weeks. And everyone understands that we might not be able to give people absolute certainty, but they were expecting the First Minister to give them some kind of hope.
But the First Minister said she believed this to be a firm and sustainable way out of lockdown. Alexandra Mackenzie, BBC News, Glasgow.
Well, Nicola Sturgeon now finds herself dealing not only with the pandemic, but also with an increasingly bitter conflict with her predecessor as First Minister Alex Salmond. At the heart of the row is an inquiry into the Scottish Government's handling of harassment claims made against Mr Salmond back in 2018. Mr Salmond was due to give evidence to a parliamentary committee tomorrow, but earlier this evening he told the committee that he would not be giving evidence as planned, but offered to appear on Friday instead. Our Scotland editor Sarah Smith has this report.
As he was acquitted of 13 counts of sexual assault after a criminal trial last year, Alex Salmond made it clear he wants to tell his side of the story and settle some scores.
There are certain evidence that I would have liked to have seen led in this trial, but for a variety of reasons we were not able to do so. At some point, that information, that facts and that evidence will see the light of day.
This has become a bitter battle between once close friends as well as deeply entwined political allies. They are now publicly trading accusations of lying and conspiracy, as Nicola Sturgeon and Alex Salmond have very different accounts of what happened when the Scottish Government investigated Mr Salmond over complaints of sexual harassment. Alex Salmond says in written evidence, Nicola Sturgeon's account of meetings they had is false and manifestly untrue. He also claims there was a malicious and concerted effort by a number of people, including Nicola Sturgeon's husband and her chief of staff, to damage my reputation, even to the extent of having me imprisoned.
He appears to be suggesting some kind of conspiracy or concerted campaign against him without a shred of evidence.
As well as walking free from the criminal trial, he also won a legal battle in 2018 against the Scottish Government, when a court found that the procedure used to investigate allegations of sexual harassment against him was unlawful. A Holyrood parliamentary committee is now investigating how the Scottish Government got it so wrong, and that's the inquiry which wants to take evidence from Alex Salmond in person this week. Now, Alex Salmond has announced tonight that he will not appear as scheduled in front of that committee on Wednesday. That's because when his written evidence was published, the Crown Office, that's the prosecution service in Scotland, raised legal concerns about some of it. So the evidence was taken down, certain paragraphs were removed, and then the document was made available again. But Alex Salmond and his lawyers are worried now about how that might constrain what he can say in front of the inquiry. So they want to take until Friday to consider the legal implications of this. And meanwhile, Nicola Sturgeon is eagerly awaiting her turn to appear in front of the committee, saying she will relish the opportunity to refute what she calls baseless allegations against her.
Sarah, many thanks again for the update. Sarah Smith, our Scotland editor. The Duke of Edinburgh, who's been in hospital in central London since last Tuesday, is not expected to leave for several days, according to Buckingham Palace. Prince Philip, who is 99, is being treated for an infection and is said to be comfortable. Let's talk to our royal correspondent, Nicholas Witchell, who's with me. Nick, do we know more than that?
Tonight, Hugh will be his 8th night in hospital. He was admitted last Tuesday, as you mentioned, having felt unwell. We were given no clue as to the nature of that illness, other than that it is not COVID-related. So, this afternoon, a short statement from the palace, from which we learn that he is receiving medical attention for an infection. Again, no details about the nature of that infection. The statement then went on. He is comfortable and responding to treatment, but he's not expected to leave hospital for several days. Now, separately, Prince Edward has told a journalist that his father is a lot better. Bear in mind, hitherto we've been told that he was in good spirits from the moment he went into hospital. Prince Edward went on, he's looking forward to getting out of hospital, so we keep our fingers crossed. Now, all in all, for someone who is just 15 weeks short of his 100th birthday now, I would think that that would seem fairly reassuring.
Nick, thanks very much again. Nicholas Witchell there, our royal correspondent. Unemployment has risen to its highest rate in nearly 5 years, hitting 5.1% in the 3 months to December. The figures suggest that younger workers are bearing the brunt of job losses. Our business correspondent Sarah Corker reports from Blackpool, which has one of the highest rates of unemployment for young people.
15 weeks.
For 9 months of the year, Blackpool lives or dies on the tourism trade. But the sound of the seagulls is now louder than the screams from the roller coasters. The owners of Blackpool Tower and other major attractions here say lockdown has taken away many of the jobs young people relied on.
65% of our workforce is under the age of 24, so it's really hit them hard. It's been devastating for them. So last year, when we would normally have taken on our seasonal recruits, they didn't get a job. They've spent all of that time, or most of that time, in lockdown.
Today's figures show there were 726,000 fewer workers on payrolls last month compared with the start of the pandemic. Nearly 60% of that drop, more than 400,000 workers, were those aged under 25.
Locked up and virtually deserted, seasonal work here in Blackpool has disappeared, and with more people chasing fewer jobs, less experience, young people are missing out as a result.
Oliver wants to be a mechanic. He's got ADHD and autism and says the pandemic has made the job hunt harder for him.
Sort of quite stressful, to be honest, because I'm looking for jobs. I try to apply for jobs and I don't get anything other than a email saying that you've been unsuccessful. I keep on looking, and there's nothing there. But I mean, at the end of the day, if you keep on trying, I'm sure there's something you can.
For the last 30 years, Linda's been a youth worker here and warns some people are at crisis point.
We're looking at a generation that have fear for the future and have no hope for the future. So what we need to do is ensure that we offer them the training and the skills so that they're ready. When the work opportunities are available, they're ready.
There is a brighter outlook for Ewan. He'd been looking for an apprenticeship for 3 years. In December, he got taken on.
Financially, it's been a struggle, paying bills and paying for food and stuff like that. It's hard. But now that I've got a wage, I feel relieved and just over the moon.
The government has set up a £2 billion scheme to help the under-25s, and as lockdown eases, those looking for work hope the jobs they depend on will come back soon. Sarah Corker, BBC News in Blackpool.
Yemen is at risk of the worst famine the world has seen in decades, according to the United Nations. The UN warns that 16 million people will go hungry this year, including some 400,000 children who will suffer from what it calls severe acute malnutrition and could die without urgent treatment. Yemen was already the Arab world's poorest country before its civil war escalated in 2015. Houthi rebels, backed by Iran, control most of the population situation there. The Yemeni government, which is helped by a Saudi-led coalition, which is backed by the UK, has been carrying out a bombing campaign in support of the internationally recognised government. Our international correspondent Orla Gearing's report from southern Yemen does contain some distressing scenes from the start.
Every breath is a struggle, and he is dangerously thin. Mohammed Amar is 12 months old, but too weak to hold his head up. He's in the grip of severe acute malnutrition. Mohammed needs to go to hospital urgently. His mother, Huria, knows, but can do nothing.
أكيد مشان ابني أيوة بس يعني كانوا حولوني بس ما معيش يعني عايش مستطيع معي 4 وهذا الخامس الحمد لله يعني يقولوا لنا إن السكة يعني نحن نمشي حالنا.
This rural clinic couldn't provide transport for Mohammed. We were able to give mother and baby a lift to the hospital an hour away. This was a chance encounter in Taiz province, an area ravaged by hunger in one of the world's poorest countries. Malnutrition was entrenched in Yemen before the war, but has increased every year since. At Halifa Hospital, doctors do what they can. They say Mohammed's weight is about half what it should be, and he has a chest infection. He's put on oxygen, a lifeline for now.
We can help the case which reach to our hospital, but there is a lot of baby cannot reach to our hospital. So this is the problem.
Are you afraid that there are children dying at home?
Yes, there is a lot of cases dying at home due to a lot of factors or a lot of causes.
Those causes are complex, but don't include lack of food in the markets. There's plenty to buy, but many can't afford it. 6 years of conflict have taken their toll. Food prices have risen about 140%. The Yemeni currency has collapsed along with the economy. And the youngest here are heartbreakingly vulnerable.
Her name is Ghada Walid. She came because of acute gastroenteritis. She's 4 months old.
Tiny Ghada is deteriorating rapidly in the southern city of Aden. For her mother, Ibtida, displaced by the war, seeing her like this, rigid with pain, is another trauma. Ghada has severe acute malnutrition and is running a high fever. Dr. Maha Suleiman tries to cool down her tiny body with a cold cloth. Some of Ghada's test results come back. It's not good news.
When I found the really sick children and they keep on coming deteriorated or not responding to treatment, it's very hard. Even we have some of a sleep disturbance, really, for me. I have a sleep disturbance some nights, and it's very hard and painful. And we have even no time to change the sheet of the bed. Just to change the sheet, and other patient is just coming.
Well, doctors are now extremely concerned about Ghada. They say her case is critical. She needs an X-ray, but it's too far away across the hospital. They can't take the chance of moving her now. She's on oxygen at the moment, and they're just trying to stabilize her. As the spectre of famine hangs over Yemen, those in need are getting less food aid because of cuts in international donations. The UN says Yemenis are not starving, they are being starved. Since we filmed these pictures, Ghada has died. Orla Gearing, BBC News, Southern Yemen.
The terrible plight of so many young children there in Yemen. That was Orla Gearing reporting. The golfer Tiger Woods has been injured in a serious car crash and taken to hospital in Los Angeles. The full extent of his injuries is unknown, but his agent said that he'd suffered multiple leg injuries. Our correspondent Sophie Long is in Los Angeles with the latest.
Well, Hugh, we know the authorities were called to the crash site just south of Los Angeles just after 7 o'clock this morning. Paramedics and firefighters helped pull Tiger Woods from his SUV, which had been badly damaged after it appears to have flipped, overturned and then crashed. He's said to have been conscious at the time and taken by ambulance to hospital nearby. Now, as you say, we don't yet know the full extent of his injuries. His long-term agent issued a statement saying he sustained multiple leg injuries and was now undergoing surgery. He also thanked people for their support and privacy at this time. Now, what we know is that Tiger Woods had been travelling alone in the Rancho Palos Verdes coastal town, very windy roads with beautiful views over the Pacific. We also know no other vehicle was involved. What we don't know is what caused that crash, and that is now being investigated. It was hoped that Tiger Woods, who was recovering from this back surgery, might be able to compete in the Masters due to take place in April. That, of course, now looking all but unlikely.
Sophie, many thanks for the latest in Los Angeles. Sophie Long. Now, the head of the Competition and Markets Authority has described Australia's proposed regulation of big tech platforms as sensible and suggested that the UK should follow a similar path. Dr. Andrea Coscelli said that the dominance of Facebook and Google in the advertising world was also a problem. He's been speaking with our media editor, Amol Raja.